All right. Hello. Welcome back to the Gumtree of Liberty podcast, episode 2. I'm your host, LibertyDownUnder, and with me today I've got my co-hosts, CentristOzzy and AusRattleSnake. And today we thought we'd have a go at looking at the political compass, especially in an Australian context, but just in general as well. And we want to start this by saying, of course, that, we're biased. Of course, I'm AimCap, centrist is centrist, and AusRattleSnake is somewhere in the middle there. So we're all
somewhere.
obviously, biased towards being liberty-minded individuals. And of course, anyone who looks at the test is going to be biased themselves because, we're all humans. So no one has a perfect view of every political position in the world. So everyone's going to be biased. Obviously, the tests themselves are biased. The compass is biased to an extent. So just keep in mind that, obviously, you might not agree with everything we say today because, we're human. We're all fallible. So I think that the first thing we should get out of the way is, for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be using the 4-quadrant test, not the straight line test. If you're watching the YouTube, it's CentristOzzy's profile is the compass test. For those who are listening on Spotify or the other podcasting platforms, it's basically a quadrant system. So you've got, in the top right is authoritarian right, top left is authoritarian left, bottom left is libertarian left, and bottom right is libertarian right. We're all, myself and Rattlesnake, are bottom right somewhere, and centrist is about on the line in between bottom right and bottom left, just to give you guys an idea of generally where we sit on the compass.
And I guess depending on the topic, it changes as well. Sometimes I might be on the other side, on the left, depending on the topic. Sometimes I'm on the right, depending on the topic.
Well, I think that's true for most libertarians. A lot of libertarians are often socially progressive and economically, fiscally conservative. Although you got some people, you got the Hoppian anarchists who are more socially conservative than a lot of other people are. Like I myself, am more progressive when it comes to general politics. Yeah, but in my personal life, I'm more of a socially conservative kind of guy. Coming from a Christian background myself. So that's just generally in general where I sit on it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Generally, in my own personal life, I base myself off right-leaning ideas around stuff like personal responsibility and all of that. But then I would never sort of want to push my rules upon the population. So that's like why I still believe in some left-wing issues, such as I personally am not into, say, gay marriage. Like I would never get married to another man, but I'm not going to stop other people from doing that because I feel like that's wrong.
Like you can't control someone else's moral life just because of your own personal morals.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Cool. All right. So should we first off start, I think, with some definitions of some of our main political movements that everyone sort of knows. We'll sit them on the compass where people culturally and societally think they sit right now. I've got a good graph I'll try and bring up. Which should give an idea. And then maybe we can break it down a little bit and discuss where I could mount arguments of where one political movement probably doesn't sit where it is on this chart because it doesn't fall in line with what else sits on the chart. And vice versa. And then we can go through. So we'll go through the main ones like communism, fascism, and obviously ANCAP and anarcho-communism as well. They're the ones that are typically positioned on the far right corners. But I think there's an argument can be made which can break down both of them, all of them into different categories and swing them either way, depending on how you view the world.
Definitely. I think before we get straight into that, I think it would be good to point out a few of the issues with the quadrants just before we jump straight in. So I think some of the issues with the quadrant test in general is that it changes depending on your culture. So if you come from a Western society or if you come from an Eastern society, the quadrant sort of, the perspective on the quadrant can change a lot. And also through time. So say somebody looking at this quadrant test in the 1800s might look at it very differently to someone who's looking at it now. So, and could also be very different in, say, 100 years' time.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, especially when we get into talking about the two main ones that everyone likes to talk about, which is communism and fascism, because I think how the quadrant was divvied up in the 1930s with their climate and what was happening at the time, I think we'll explain a few things as to why fascism was pushed so far to the right, as opposed to where, in my mind, I think it sits more to the left. But we'll get into that once I bring that chart up. So you want me to bring it up now?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
See if I can get this to work. Bear with me, I'm a boomer.
This will be fun for the people listening on the podcasting platforms. We'll try and describe it to you guys. As well, but
I can do a run through of it if you like. So,
sure.
Yeah. It is a pretty simplistic graphic that sort of just puts different ideologies inside of the quadrants so that you can sort of make more sense. It gives it more boxes so that you're not just like, oh, you're right wing. There's more to being right wing and more to being left wing than just being in those bigger categories.
Yeah, I'll try and link a link to the Google version of this in the podcast show notes, just so people can get a reference for that if need be, if that works.
All right, so I've got it open in my Paint because I've been having a look at it to see how it works. Okay, so is that just sharing the window?
Yep.
Correct. Yes.
So if I go back to, is it just? Hang on, let's see if I can go. Does that? Oh, yep. There we go. Cool. I can see it now and talk to you guys. All right, cool. So I'll do a bit of a rundown then. So basically, the graph we've got, it's got the 4 quadrants in it. It's listed a run of different groups in terms of where they sit according to this on the spectrum. Like I said, you've got your anarcho-capitalist as your bottom far right. You've got your anarcho-communism, which is your bottom far left. You've got communism and national communism, which is at your far left top, and your fascism and fundamentalism on your far right top corner. And then throughout the whole spectrum, so going across the top, you've got totalitarianism, nationalism, traditionalism, national socialism. You've got statism, authoritarianism, conservatism, ultra-capitalism on the far right, socialism on the far left, which I think you could probably make an argument for both of them being a bit closer than the outreach. Social democrat. In the center, we've got social democratism, liberalism and progressivism, which, then on the left again, we've got democratic socialism, left libertarianism, anarcho-socialism, anarcho-collectivism, and the bottom right, we've got the libertarianism, mutualism, anarchism, ultra-anarchism. So that sort of gives people a quick rundown. There's a few different groups there, but what I think we'll do today is we'll just focus on the main one that everyone knows, because they're obviously what everyone talks about. So
yeah. And I think also pointing that out, when I look at this graph, a lot of people probably tend towards the centers groups more, but then they will use the extremes to describe their opponents.
Yes. Yeah, it happens from all sides as well.
Today's society.
Yeah. People on the right calling everyone a commie, and people on the left calling everyone a fascist. It's 9 times out of 10, most people aren't full communists, and 9 times out of 10, people aren't fascists at all. So
that's the reason why on social media I won't call the Australian government right now communist or fascist, just because, although they're authoritarian, they're not necessarily fitting every they don't meet every criterion just for that test. It's just using labels to create over dramatize the situation and that sort of stuff. It's not necessarily 100% accurate in giving them those labels. It's important to be careful in how you label someone as well.
You you could make an argument for them heading towards fascistic tendencies because of the, which I think is something when we get into understanding what fascism actually is the state with the coercion with the government. I think Dave Smith, who's the American libertarian, did an interview the other day, and he nailed it pretty much. Is basically it doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you're on. If you're coercing business to do the state's bidding, then you're a fascist. So although it's done without necessary direct contact, the coercion from the government to make business do what they want them to do, you could argue is tending towards the fascism.
And I think in general, fascism seems to be more of a tool than an actual political group that people identify with.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, which is again, we might as well just stick along this path with the fascism then, because obviously it's the one that gets thrown around the most.
Yeah. Especially with the anti-fascists out there.
Yeah, who are acting like fascists, which is funny. So the fascism, ultimately, at the end of the day, fascism, the two main ones we know of that everyone talks about is obviously the Italians with Mussolini and Hitler with the Nazis. Fascism is a form of socialism, which people don't like to hear, but it's those two main courses follow the same thinking as socialism. And when you get up towards your national communism, like at the top left that we've got there, there's not a lot of difference between them. I'm sorry. The thinking for fascism has spawned from Marxism. So although it was taken a slightly different direction to where the communists were heading.
No, I think we've lost him. I'll keep saying I'll continue the conversation until he comes back into the call. But basically, I wouldn't go as far to say that fascism is socialism. I think it's probably a cross between corporatism and socialism, somewhere in between those two. National socialism is definitely more towards the left side of things. The difference between National Socialism and communism to me is that communism divides by class, whereas National Socialism divides by, or Nazism divides by race. Of course, in the German context, that was the Jews, obviously, you know, the rich Jews versus everyone else. And even then, you know, the Jews were attacked because they're the rich people. In the Soviet Union, for example, Stalin was anti-Semitic himself. So you could draw parallels there between Stalin and Hitler in that regard.
Yeah.
In the sense that both of them were anti-Semitic and both of them had elements of socialism in their government and in their policies. Like you read, I've had the joy of reading Mein Kampf at some point. I had to read part of it from the uni and then read it going forward from there. And it's very, very poorly written, but the general gist of it is, you know, Hitler is attacking Bolshevism, which is more along the lines of Lenin. Obviously, that you're talking going back to 1919, the Russian Revolution, that sort of stuff, as when you get back to Bolshevism. Hitler is outright against Bolsheviks, but he also at the same time incorporates a lot of socialist ideas into his system. For example, both Hitler and Mussolini praised FDR for his New Deal, and they praised it for being somewhat along the lines of thinking that they were. Of course, you got Hitler, who was made a Times Man of the Year in 1938 as well. But you definitely, the fact that they were praising FDR, who is generally considered to be the most progressive left-wing president of American history, the fact that they're praising him definitely means they aren't far right, because if they were far right, why are they praising the most progressive president America's ever had? That argument makes no sense to me for that.
Yeah.
One of the issues that we will come in contact with is whether or not something is actually left or right, or whether it's authoritarian or libertarian. like certain ideologies, when they move up towards authoritarianism, care more about authoritarianism than they do their tribal left or right.
Yeah, that's the best
I
point.
feel
Sorry for
like
dropping
that's
out
the
before.
same with libertarianism. When we go down towards libertarianism, we care a little bit less about whether someone's left or right, and a little bit more whether or not they're trying to control us.
That depends on who you're talking to. So some people are quite tribal, but
Yes,
some
yeah.
like us are more unity-minded. I know America in particular tends to be quite divisive in between, with like gatekeeping and purity tests and that sort of stuff. But libertarians in other countries like Australia tend to be more in favor of unity and big tent libertarianism than others are, purely because we're even more of a minority here than we are in other places. So there's much more of a mindset of working with other people to achieve common goals.
Yes, we're also a big, wide, open country. So if someone's over there doing their own thing, it really doesn't bother you.
Do you want to bring that the table back up there, Centrist?
Yeah, sorry about that before, guys.
That's
I don't know
all
what happened.
It's Australia's internet is notoriously bad. And the first time we live streamed, we live streamed for 4 seconds, and the internet cut out for where I am, so we had to restart the live stream. It's just not the greatest. It's for those who don't know, it's basically government organized internet for everyone, and it's really, really poorly set up.
And,
originally it was supposed to be good, but then apparently it was too expensive, so they swapped out all the fiber optics with copper wires.
Yeah, halfway through.
It didn't work out well, and they ended up spending more money putting in copper wires than they would if they just finished it. But that's politics for you.
Go ahead. Cool. All right. All right. So we did the fascism, socialism thing. So I think I don't know if you guys agree, but I think fascism probably falls more towards the center left rather than far right.
I'd put it on that graph we have right now. I'd put it as probably where they've got totalitarianism, probably center left authoritarian. As I was saying before, when you cut out, it's not socialism per se, but it's a mixture of socialism and corporatism, so it's not 100% either direction. I think the main problem with this graph is that it sees corporatism as being capitalism, which it isn't. Corporatism is government favoritism of certain businesses and leads to monopolies and oligarchies in the economy, which is definitely not a capitalist thing at all. Capitalism is more, or at least how we see it is more free market. So I think there's a misunderstanding there into how they've set this up.
I think what also people forget with the fascism is that I'll get that quote up as well, and I'll read that out in a minute. But the state taking control of the business, which is what happened, despite the businesses supposedly bailing out the state, that deal is still like that. The fact, which like you were saying, corporatism, the fact that the state controls production is not a right wing, like a capitalist position to take. The state should have no say. If you are talking real far right, like your anarchos and ultra capitalism, the government would have no say in the business at all.
So you mean far right? You mean far right in terms of the economy, right?
Yes.
We should clarify that when we say far right and far left, we're talking about the horizontal economy axis. So for the quadrant, you've got the x-axis, the horizontal axis is on the left is your communism and socialism, on your right is capitalism, and then you've got the top down, the y-axis, which is authoritarianism to anarchism. Just to clarify that. So when we're saying far right, we don't mean fascist, neo-Nazi far right. We mean
we're not talking about the cultural
ultimate free markets.
Political ideology, political theory terms, not the cultural buzzword terms.
Yeah, well, that's the reason why fascism was considered right wing. Goes to the culture at the time. So in the 1930s, fascism was considered right wing because it was what the communists were called. Because communism and fascism were the two fighting each other. The main thing The capitalist was actually the Jewish population, so they both sort of hated the Jews for being capitalists. The fascists were considered right wing because they were right wing of communism, not because they were right wing as capitalists.
Yes. I think it's important when you talk about fascism. We've grown up in a culture which, I guess, teaches people that fascism is Nazism. Yeah. When they are somewhat different, there is nuance there that has to be understood.
Yeah.
For example, Hitler took the ideas of fascism, but he also took the ideas of nationalism, and he took the ideas of white supremacy, and he merged them into each other. And I think a lot of people are stuck on the idea that fascism equals white supremacy, when white supremacy is its own beast and fascism is its own beast. Yeah. And both of them can be separated, and both of them can be merged together.
For example, on that point, the argument I like to go to is the argument of Japan, who was not in World War II was not strictly fascist, but they weren't strictly conservative authoritarian either. They were in the middle somewhere. But the fact that you got an Asian country being somewhat fascist means that it's obviously not necessarily like an only white person thing. Other countries can be fascist. Again, like it's important to take care to keep that racial element separate from the politics side of thing.
To add to that, I think because back then, the other thing to remember is that race didn't necessarily mean color. Race meant sorry, just dropped the mic. Race meant nationalistic, which is why nationalism was a big part of fascism, was because it was about shoring up, because your country state was important. You needed to make sure that your countrymen were looked after, and so fascists went down a militaristic type approach to building up your country's position in the world, I suppose. So it's definitely fascism definitely has a root in terms of race, but it's not typically necessarily how we explain it now. Because everyone's got to remember, Hitler was stuck into some crazy, whacked out conspiracy crap as well. Like, it wasn't just he was a bad person who did all this stuff. He was literally like almost crazy. Like, the guy was like hoodwinked into, I wouldn't say hoodwinked, he fell into like a full conspiracy theory about the Jews, and that's why he was so militant, Aryan Brotherhood type stuff.
Well, I mean, to be fair to Hitler, I know that sounds weird saying to be fair to Hitler, but towards the end of the middle of the war, Hitler was being given drugs daily by his doctor as well.
Yeah, the guy had lost the plot earlier on. He was he was right in on it. Yeah.
Yeah, he was like a drug addict and that sort of stuff at the same time. So you do have to consider that there's also that, which makes him even crazier.
Steeping yourself in hatred like that will do that to a person, for sure. I think something to point out about our culture in general is when you look at the way that different groups are explained as well. You've got white supremacists, and they are usually explained as right wing, but then you've got black supremacists, and people will explain them as left wing, when their ideas are exactly the same. It's just the race that is different.
Yeah, I'm not big on supremacy, full stop.
Yeah, full stop, I'm against it. Obviously,
I think where that comes from is, okay, we'll take, for example, look at the Black Panthers, for example. Yes. Which were a black nationalist group in America. They're seen as more left wing because they wanted to implement more socialist style policies with like housing and education and healthcare and that sort of stuff, because they saw black people as being more disadvantaged in the system. They wanted to implement more social style or progressive style economic policies, which is why they're seen as being more left wing. But yeah, for some reason,
in fairness, when you have that discussion, though, that's exactly what that's what Hitler did as well. Whether you'd like to admit it or not, that's what Hitler did. His ideals, though, was based around the German nation. So he felt that the German people themselves were the ones who were being falling behind and not reaching the peak of where they should be because of the Jewish influence and the influence of communism and stuff on society. So that's why he was. That's why he went and argued the point for the same stuff. But I know it's weird because you hear it like, why would the Germans think that they're underprivileged? But that's where he was coming from. That's why his views and how he shaped what he was doing was because he felt that the German race was falling behind where it should be, especially after being smashed in World War One. Because he fought in World War One and he didn't like the way the Germans fell and that fact that they owed a shit ton of reparations after the war. So
yeah, and they were a very proud country that had had a lot of progress in the years before World War One.
Yeah.
I think I just want to bring up this question because speaking theoretically, communism is there, like in a theoretical sense, to serve the working class. That's the point of it, to a theoretical point. What does fascism hope to serve theoretically?
The national class.
The national class.
That's why when we had that chat offline, I was saying that there's still an element of nationalism in it because we got to remember also we're talking from a country where we don't have borders for one, but two, we don't have that rich of combat history, if that makes sense. So like when you talk the Germanic tribes, like they were doing it for centuries. Like it's not like this country just like decided they were better than everyone else. Like this is a almost tribal thing that they've been doing from so long ago.
Yeah, and you see that in Europe, you see that in Asia, all over it, where for about like a few thousand years, they've all been warring over bits of land amongst themselves.
And you go back,
and so that's why nationalism is more important in those areas.
You go back to the times of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, and the Germans were seen as the laughingstock of Europe because they were a bunch of disunited princes who were always squabbling over small bits of land. Until you get to 1871, when they beat the French in the Franco-Prussian War, and then now they get to form Germany in its true form, or what they saw as being its true form. So, yeah, they're intensely patriotic as well, in like an extremely nationalist and a warrior race through and through.
Yeah, Europe in general, each individual country is to some extent patriotic because of that history of constant wars between the nations of Europe.
And
Western and Central Europe. Western and Central Europe are more homogenous.
Go, mate, sorry.
Yeah, Western and Central Europe, they're more homogenous in terms of race. So they're mostly like one race in that country to a large extent. Whereas in Eastern Europe, it's a lot more of a patchwork of races. That's the old Ottoman, Russian, and Habsburg, Austrian land. It's a lot more patchwork when it comes to races. So those countries have a different form of nationalism to Western Europe. Western Europe is more patriotic. Eastern Europe is more nationalist in terms of whichever race is dominant in that country, even though there are large minority races, they'll try and enforce that race on everyone else. For example, Hungary right now has a policy where if you're a Hungarian mother and you have 4 kids, you're tax exempt because they're trying to encourage breeding of Hungarian children and to stop migrants coming into Hungary and, make sure that it's more of a Hungarian first style system. So we've got to keep that in mind as well, that you're looking at very different styles of nationalism. Germany, for example, has that large Polish minority in Eastern Germany with the borders of the time. And obviously they've got the Jews as well, whereas Italy was almost entirely Italian. So Italy went more fascist and Germany went more Nazi because they had to include much more overtly nationalist, just because they had those. On their border regions they had Polish and Czechs and whatnot.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we've covered fascism and communism pretty well.
Yeah. Where do you want to take us next?
What if we look into? Actually, we'll go. What we'll do is we'll work our way down. So rather than going all the way down to the bottom, let's go to the middle, and we'll talk about socialism and ultra capitalism, as they put it on this chart, or capitalism in my mind. If you do capitalism, maybe pure capitalism is probably the best word for it. Because I'll put it from my point of view, being a centrist, in terms of, I don't really fit into this chart the way I think it's like you guys said, it's worried because it kind of puts you in boxes when most people sort of fluctuate between the different boxes. Being in the middle, I'm pro-socialist policies, but I also understand that if I want to have socialist policies like healthcare, healthcare, a welfare system for when people need it, all those sort of things, we can't do that without a proper capitalist economy backing it up and paying for it. So when I hear socialists hang crap on capitalism, it really does my head in, because how else do you think you're going to pay for everything? But I also understand their frustrations when capitalism gets turned into corporate capitalism or corporatism, because we don't run with a proper capitalist system. Government gets its fingers involved, and that's when everything kind of goes to shit. When they overtax or provide tax loopholes for a fair, even distribution of who we tax. And I know you guys are pretty libertarian, so you're the whole tax is theft thing.
Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah, but I can sit there and rationalize paying a certain amount in order to get back. But again, a lot of that comes down to the fact that you've then got to have a government that has checks and balances. And the problem is most governments run away, and they govern themselves out of their checks and balances, as we can see in America at the moment.
My personal issue with, say, tax is I cannot understand paying tax to, say, fix the roads in my local area, but I don't really like the idea of paying tax to fund wars in other countries or to fund things that I wouldn't consent to myself. So, like if it's for community building in my immediate area, I like the idea of paying tax to support my community. And I would do that even if the government wasn't putting a gun to us to say, hey, pay your tax. I would still help out and pay my share for my community. But I also don't like the idea of paying for things that I don't have control over.
Yeah, that's the grit of it, I think. And I think this I think is why I think this context, when people have this discussion, especially online, goes missing. Because people want to think that one system works guaranteed. But we know for a fact that when you end up trying to play one system permanently, it doesn't work. Yes. I know that Mr. ANCAP over here will probably argue that with me.
That's the ANCAP in the room.
Yeah. My point being, though, is that you could say, let's have an anarcho-capitalist system, but I could still find points where I could argue that I don't think it's any different to if anarcho-capitalism was to come in and let free reign, it would still turn into a corporatism, because people would end up being favoured depending on who's got the most money.
Yep. There's a few issues that I have with anarcho-capitalism, and I would say that one of them is people are born with different abilities.
Yeah.
And it will favour the strongest and leave behind the weakest in general.
Well, the thing is, like, in an anarchist society, like, you can have some people who are capitalists, and you can also have people who go and live in a commune where they will support one another. So, although I'm anarcho-capitalist, like, I'm personally a capitalist, I'm more of an anarchist in the sense that, like, if we have an anarchist society, then I don't care if you want to go set up a commune where you all help one another. Like, I personally disagree with you guys. I think having the free markets, giving them free reign will be beneficial, but, like, I don't care if you want to go set up a commune or a local council area where you guys, like, pay for your roads in a communal sense. Like, because that's ultimately what libertarians ultimately are like. Leave me alone, and I don't care what you do. So, like, if like again, like if I don't care if you want to go create your own system where you have, I don't know, where you elect your king every 3 years or whatever we wanted to call it. Like, I don't care. Like, you do what you want. Just let me do what I want. That's the stance I take on it.
I can see that as that's a valid thing, right? But what you've got to then take into account is that you've got to then trust people. Everyone's got to buy into that, which people don't, because it doesn't matter. Like,
buying into which part of it?
Into the leave everyone alone thing, because with power comes greed, and with greed comes more power. So people who use the system, the anarcho system, and they run with it, will be able. People who do well will be able to build up wealth and be able to build up. If we bring it back to, say, for example, back into like the more 1600 type things, is that you build up private armies, and then you become. And I know people are going to have a crack at me on this one because this is a favourite for the ANCAPs.
Of course.
But with that comes you still end up creating a government system. It's just run by whoever has the most money and can afford the most.
But the thing is though that you can't force. The thing is though that you can't force people to buy your goods. So in an ANCAP society, you can't force people to buy your goods. So if you're going to do that, people will just go and buy elsewhere. You've got to give them an incentive to buy your goods.
Yeah, but you were saying, right, that people can go and make their own communes. So while people will still go and make their own communes, other people will go the other way and create armies, right? So you could argue that if because this is what we've known throughout human history. Human history is that people, when given the chance, will use their power to assert it over someone else. It's almost guaranteed throughout all of history that that's what happens. So while the philosophy of an anarcho-capitalist society is great, because everyone stay away from me, we do our own thing, and everyone looks after each other, and we sell our goods, etc. The problem is that certain groups will, like everything, game the system and build it up to further them, and then your system is no longer anarcho-capitalist, because if you've got warlords everywhere, then, do you know what I mean? You're not running off a free enterprise because people use their power to cut out the competition.
Look, we could debate this for hours, but I think we should probably get back on track. Just keep us on, because I could debate this for hours, but yeah. So I think we'll go back to the political compass. We can do it. We can do an episode later on where you and I can have a fight about anarcho-capitalism and versus socialism and centrism. But
yeah,
that's a whole different show.
No fight.
I would like to point out that anarchism in general has the issue of the Pareto distribution coming into it. So when certain groups will gain power and people organize towards a certain thing. So I feel like when anarchism has ever happened in our history on a large scale, people eventually self-organize into groups and governments.
Yep. I'd go with that. Oh, he's not.
So say,
yeah.
Say if we had anarchism in Australia, it might last, say, 20 years or something. But then what I feel like would eventually happen is that we would end up with maybe 20 or 30 different small countries on the continent of Australia that all have different views.
I guarantee you that within 20, it wouldn't even be 20 years, it'd be 5 years, and Western Australia would be its own country. I can guarantee it. The tribalism for West Australians over here, like especially now with the slinging that's going on between the premiers, I reckon give it. We just went, screw it, government's gone, let's go anarcho-capitalist, or even anarcho-communist, whatever you want to call it. WA would eventually become its own country with a king.
Yeah,
and
I mean, even though
the problem is that's it's a mindset issue. That's what the problem is. It's a mindset issue. So right now, with people's current mindset and approach to society, and anarcho-capitalism wouldn't work. You can't do an anarchist system under what we've got right now because people's mindset is different to the ideal mindset you'd have for an anarcho-capitalist society, in my opinion.
Yeah.
True.
Which
It's more of a mindset
I agree
problem.
with. Yeah, I agree with that, but it's not just mindset; it's also human nature that you got to consider. So we're also, with all these things that we're talking theoretical stuff here, with all these different positions of how we should run, how we should govern, how we should do all these things. But we've got to also remember that biologically we're just an animal, and we're a herd animal. So we work into herds, whether we like to admit it or not. That's just what we are. That's it. And you can fight it. Biologically, evolution, everything has pushed us towards this system, which is why certain systems work better than other systems, and why some systems fall apart, because at the end of the day, your biology is going to tell you what you're going to do, whether you like it or not.
I think that's true of people in general, because if you take any sort of profession in general, say like chefing, a chef can make food out of things that have been provided. So they don't necessarily know how to farm, they don't know how to make a knife, they don't know how to make an oven. So we have to organize as an industry to be able to come together and have someone build that oven, and have someone make that knife, and have someone farm that food so the chef can eventually make the product and put it on the table. So people will naturally organize to get a job done.
Yep.
Yeah, but that, like, organization is fun. The problem I have is when government gets involved in it. But you people are always going to organize. Like, for example, being a Christian myself, like, I'm not going to say that get rid of the church, for example. Like, organizations can still exist.
Of course, yeah.
But the problem is coercive organizations is where I have a problem. So if it's voluntary, I don't care. Like, if people decided, you know what, screw this, we're going to voluntarily create a government. There are 3,000 of us here. We're going to create our own society with the government voluntarily, and every person who has the option, like every person when they turn 18, gets to sign a piece of paper to live in that country, or they can go live somewhere else if they want to. And you get to renew that every 10 years. They have a ceremony where everyone comes and renews their citizenship voluntarily. And or you can leave if you don't live there anymore. Then I'm fine with it because it's voluntary. That's my problem is that what we have right now with the government is not voluntary. Like, if I don't want to live in Australia, where do I go? Like, for example, like every other country is a country. There's nowhere that's not a country. There's nowhere that's where no country exists, if that makes sense. So there's nowhere where I can live in a voluntary society. So yeah, I don't care if you want to create a commune or a voluntary government, but as long as the key word there is voluntary.
Are you? Can I ask you? Are you advocating for open borders?
Yeah, because it's in a society in an ANCAP society, there's no government. Yep. And where there's no government, there's no borders. Because borders only exist because the government enforces. The borders exist to give the government a set area where the government has the monopoly on power. That's what borders exist for. So in an anarchist society, you're not going to have borders because you have no country. Borders are useless without a country to govern them.
Gotcha.
Cool. All right.
Anyway,
that's the anarcho side of things we covered.
There's definitely the anarcho side of things.
It is,
and it has
on
valid
topic.
points, for sure.
Yeah, and it is on topic because this is the whole point, is to discuss these different concepts, and obviously go into a bit more depth with it, because you could say, like, we can say something to someone like, well, actually, I'll use the perfect example. I'd never heard of mutualism until today, and I found this thing. It's not something that has ever popped up on my radar. And then if you say some of the other ones, which was the kicker was that national communism, which is basically fascism. Like, there's two terminologies there that I personally hadn't really ever heard of, and I've delved into it a little bit. So getting into and explaining the intricacies regarding what's anarcho-capitalist, what's anarcho-communist, etc., is probably really good, because it gives people understanding that none of these boxes are clear cut, and exact and precise, and people interpret it a different way each time they read it. And that maybe it's probably a good circle back. To quote Jen Psaki, that it's probably a good way to come back to the fact that maybe these labels where we're calling everyone far left and far right really need to get thrown out the window. We need to stop using them because it's not helping having a real conversation about how people should probably view politics, to be honest, because if we're viewing it through a lens where we think something far right is evil and demonic, or something far left is evil and demonic, then we're not doing it justice, and we're not having a fair and open discussion about what people actually feel they think is best for the community.
Yeah, definitely agree. I feel like there is an element to the political compass which is to divide us, whether that's intentional or not. I feel like that only really ever helps, sorry to use the buzzword, but the elites. Like when the people are divided, arguing about whether or not communism or fascism is the same thing, or they're different, or which one's better, or if people are divided along different lines, it's a lot easier to control the population.
Yeah, because then people don't come together on the things that they agree on, which is again why it's important to sort of break down our understanding of what's considered far left, far right, top, bottom, all that sort of stuff, is because I've went through and I've had this discussion with quite a few people, is that a lot of which is funny to watch from an outsider when watching the American political scene, is that I don't know if you guys saw, I think it was this last weekend just gone, they had the End the Damn Wars March, which is organised by a libertarian guy, grouped up with a lot of left-leaning people, and they had Max Blumenthal was talking at it. But what really, because the whole point was that it was supposed to be about unity, what really shocked me that I didn't see any of, because I don't think any of them reached out to him, is the MAGA group. Because regardless of what you think, a lot of the people I know who are MAGA were very anti-war. They did not want. They wanted out of the wars as well. So
that was one of Trump's main policies, was to get out of the wars.
Yes, which I think every politician ever has always run on that policy. But the crew, the people who voted for him, like the everyday, I'm not talking about your rhinos and all that. Your everyday run-of-the-mill people who were MAGA were very anti-war. They wanted all their kids brought back, because they understand that the same with the lefties is that it's their working class kids that are being sent overseas to fight wars.
Yeah.
So can you imagine the protests if you had MAGA and the communists and everyone all walking together fighting against the wars? That would have been quite the epic march, I think. So it'll be interesting to see if they can bridge that gap, because I think that's going to be really important going forward for them, because I've said it before with other comedians. I think Jimmy Dawes' interview with Magnus was probably the kicker for me, was when they turned on Jimmy, because obviously Magnus is the left-wing libertarian. He's a member of the group called the Boogaloo Boys, but he's left. He's pretty far left. But when Jimmy was interviewing him, Jimmy copped flack for him being far right, because I believe it was, a photo circulated where he was protesting the lockdowns, and that happened to coincide with where the MAGA crew were at. And I was like, yeah, because if you understand libertarianism, that makes sense. Because it's obviously, you know what I mean? Like, it's not a black and white image. This isn't a left or right policy. This is a top-bottom thing. So just because someone is left-wing doesn't mean they can't agree with the right wing, which is where I think we're trying to get with what we're doing here with our podcast now that we're trying to get going, is trying to let people understand, trying not to fall into the same trap, that this left-right thing isn't really useful to anyone. It's the top-bottom that we're going to be careful of.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Like, there is a lot of this idea that, or a lot of this push in the current culture to make everything about left-right that I've noticed, and not a lot of emphasis on the top-bottom side of things.
Yeah, and that takes away from the ability for the everyday person to work together with people that they don't agree with. It's a very, very strong dividing tactic that's being used right now by the political class for a lot of things, just to separate people into two things.
The thing is that the establishment, whether it be the media or academics or the government, they all benefit from having the left-right divide, because if the divide was top-bottom, then they would be out of power.
Yeah, they wouldn't have a job.
So
exactly.
They need to push the left-right divide, because the establishment is both left and right. So that means they still get into power. If they did a top-bottom divide, then they'd be fighting against libertarians and anarcho-communists and the like, and that would put them in danger. So they try and, as much as they can, repress the libertarian narrative, whether it be libertarian left, libertarian right, whatever. They try and repress that narrative and keep the narrative to being left versus right, simply because that benefits them. So very few people in the establishment will recognize the existence of the political quadrant compass. They'll only recognize it as being as left and right.
Yeah, linear type thing. It's really funny because if you say something to someone who, if you were to say to someone that AOC and Steve Bannon share the same opinion on taxing the rich, everyone would think you're crazy.
But they do.
but they do.
Yeah. And so
which should really throw some alarm bells to everyone who's talking politics. It's like, if people as far left as AOC and someone who's considered far right as Steve Bannon both have the same opinions about what needs to be done in terms of taxing some of the billionaires, maybe you should look more up down rather than left right as to who you're fighting against.
Yeah, another example that's come out of the culture recently is, I guess, BLM, Black Lives Matter, where you look at it from a sort of left-right perspective. It's about sort of historic racism and all of that. And so from a left-right position, I'm on the left of that. Like, I'm against racism. But if you look at it from a top-down perspective, I don't like the policies that BLM advocates for, because it's a lot more about the authoritarian side of things. And I'm against authoritarianism. So for me to be against BLM, people plant me on the right side, but I'm not against it because of the right. Like, I'm not taking a right position on that. I'm taking a left position on that, but I'm also taking a bottom position.
Yeah, and this is where the complexity of discussion about all this stuff comes from. I think that you've got to try and remember that you can disagree with some part of an issue and agree with the other half of the issue, and that should be okay. Like, you should be allowed to say, hey, you know what, I support the fight and the protest to try and even up what we feel, regardless of whether it's there or not, what we feel is an injustice done towards people. And we can respect someone's ability to want to fight for it. But we can also sit there and go, but if you're going to try and bring in communism through means of utilizing a movement, then we should be allowed to say, I'm not okay with that bit. I'm okay with the other bit, but the other bit I'm not okay with. And we should be allowed to have that discussion.
Yeah, we on the libertarian side of things would say that, police brutality is a massive issue. Police in general, we probably believe, are a massive issue, but we also don't want communism.
Yeah. And the BLM leaders, which I found quite amusing. What I found quite amusing was the leader lady who came out and was claiming that she's a self-proclaimed Marxist communist, and then goes and buys $1 million mansions. All meanwhile, I think Vice just did an article recently with a person who was involved in one of the grassroots campaigns, who said that they're not getting any of the money at all from the national BLM, which, like, it's So so when you want to talk about, there's so many different parts of BLM specifically that you should be able to talk about that. You can condemn part of it and support the other part, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's an important thing that people lack the ability to do or are scared to do in our current society is criticize an issue or criticize a movement for the things in that movement that are an issue, but praise it for the things that it might be getting right. Maybe praise isn't the right word, but like you can agree with someone part of the way. And I think there's this move to make it more simple and say, if you don't agree with us fully, then you disagree with us.
Yeah.
They turn it into sort of this binary when it's not.
Yeah, bang on. I think that's it. I think it happens with everything. It's happening with the vaccine debates. It's happening with there's no room for nuance in today's current discourse, which isn't good.
Yeah, like for whatever reason, people who are hesitant to get this one particular vaccine are lumped in with the nut jobs that have been going off for decades that are against all vaccines. And it's like, no, they've got very different nuances to their discussions that they're talking about. And I think that it's important to, understand those nuances, listen to those nuances, and then, have your opinions after you understand the differences.
Or even the very fact that you're calling those people, those anti-vaxxers, nut jobs, shows.
Oh yeah, sorry, it might have been a bit harsh. That's obviously
my point is more along the lines that like all these anti-vaxxers as he's being anti-vaxxers for the same reason, whether it be like it could be like a personal choice, or it could be they could believe the autism argument. There's a whole variety of arguments there that they have. Even that is nuanced. There's always more and more levels of nuance. It's like the argument from Shrek, the famous, an ogre is like an onion. I think that's Shrek. I could be wrong.
It is.
An ogre is like an onion sort of quote. Yeah, so it's the idea that like there's always more and more layers of nuance. It's not just one generalization, and I think that's true with everyone. And that's what we were saying before. We shouldn't be putting people all in one box or putting people in neat boxes and saying you are this, therefore you must believe these things, because in reality, there's a lot more difference to it. There's 7 point something billion people. We're all going to have different opinions. Like, no two people have completely identical beliefs. Like, everyone's going to be different in some way.
Yeah.
So I think it's always important to keep that in mind, that there is always going to be nuance. However, the media, with the 24-hour news cycle, doesn't have time for nuance. They dramatize it and make it into a simple right versus wrong, black and white argument. There's no room for a gray area. You are either for or you are against, and that's all there is for it. They don't go into detail because it's a 24-hour news cycle. They've got to get ready for the next story that's coming out. So they always go for generalizations and drama to get more clicks and more views than going for an actual nuanced argument.
Well, that's also partly because they're pushed towards making profit. Which, I mean, when you look at it, it's a lot more profitable to create fear in a population and to sell that fear and to continuously push that fear so that people will look at you than it is to have a nuanced discussion. Because nuanced discussions take brain power, it takes thinking, it takes, working through issues and questions, whereas just selling the fear that the media does at the moment is really easy. Sort of lazy way to make money for a media organization.
Yeah, and you'll see them run both sides of a story sometimes. Like, I've been watching one of the news pages. It's like, anti-vaxxers, this. And then it's like, but
you look at that with Sky News at the moment.
And then you see them do the article about vaccines are killing people. And you're like, well, fucking, what are you trying to do here?
I noticed that with Sky News. They've got like people talking all the time about how the vaccines are going to kill you, and then they've got, was it Jackie Lambie on there the other night who was like saying, if you don't get the vaccine, we're going to come at you lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if that was Jackie Lambie or someone else.
Yeah, it was Lambie.
It was Jackie Lambie. But the thing is, like, I actually like that. Like, of all the news we have, of all the news stations we have in Australia, I think Sky News is one of the best. It's not because I agree with them on what they're saying, but the fact that they're able to have people on from a variety of different political
Yeah.
beliefs. Like one of the co-hosts, I think he's the co-host with Alan with Bolt or whatever. I think he's with Bolt. Yeah, is a former Labor MP or senator or something like that. So the fact that
Latham.
they no, not Latham.
Not Latham.
No, I'll do a Google search. But the fact that they're able to have people from One Nation, Liberals, Lib Dems, Nationals, I'm guessing they've had Katter on there at one point.
Yeah.
And also Labor and now Jackie Lambie shows that they're willing to at least talk to people from a variety of different positions. Of course, establishment left is not going to go on and talk. They do have some outspoken lefties like the former MP or senator, but the establishment left, like the ABC left, for example, they're not going to go on Sky News, but Sky News will have on people from a variety of different walks of life when it comes to politics, as opposed to ABC, where Q&A will have like all these lefties who are pro-establishment, and at the same time also have just Jordan Peterson on. Like there's that famous Jordan Peterson clip where it's Jordan Peterson against the host of Q&A, against a guest, and against all the other it's an audience member and all the other guests who are all establishment left, and he's on his own trying to defend conservative arguments. Like at least Sky's willing to have on people who aren't conservative. Like often they'll shut those people down in debates, but at least they are willing to get to the point to actually have those talks. That's what we need to see. I think all the media could learn from that. Like even though I'm going to get called out by the Murdoch conspiracy people, but I think that having people on with different viewpoints is actually beneficial. And if I'm going to get attacked for that, then I don't care. Like I believe that it's good that people are actually willing to have those talks with people from different walks of life. Like the fact that, for example, this podcast, we've got centrists, center left, center right libertarian to myself and ANCAP. It is good to see that people are willing to have on other people because we all have common. I will on Twitter, for example, I will, go on far left Twitter, looking for bad takes, and I'll occasionally get involved in arguments there with someone saying, you're a communist, therefore you have autism, or therefore you have insert mental health issue here, and I'm like, well, no, as someone who's fighting depression myself, like I'll get involved in those arguments, and I'll say like, how dare you go to people saying like you believe these certain things, therefore you are disabled. And like I actually got to the point of literally DMing one of these far leftists. I forget their name. They were literally just saying thank you for like even though I'm an ANCAP, like thank you for going against these people who are saying you believe a certain thing, therefore you're disabled. And they actually said to me that they were surprised that there was an ANCAP who actually had that viewpoint because they did not know that people on the right shared their belief on that. Like people live in their own bubbles and they don't realize that there's more to life than what they believe. And often what they believe can be wrong.
To bring that back to like what you're saying is bang on. And I think that episode of Q&A you're talking about with Jordan Peterson, I think that sort of went to prove what we've been trying to say here about the discussion being more nuanced and that people can have this thing, is because they put on Kate McGregor on there, and I thought she was brilliant. I think in that episode, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch it again and listen to what she says and how she approaches the topic, especially considering it was believed by both parties to be a bit of a setup to put Jordan Peterson and Kate together, because Kate's obviously a transgender woman. But both of them, I think, showed up the rest of the panel in that episode about how you handle discussions with people you don't necessarily agree with, or people that you think, or in this particular case, people who they thought would be disagreeing and fighting actually ended up agreeing on a couple of key issues. I think her quote that I found was probably the most enlightening in that specific thing was that you can't legislate people into acceptance. Which is a pretty powerful stance for someone like if you think about it, her position was, if you put her against Jordan Peterson, you would think that her position would be to fight what Jordan was saying. But she almost backed up Jordan's point, which is that you can't legislate people into doing what it is you want them to do, because it just doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
And there you see a cross divide of the two divides, like the supposed crazy fringe conservative that they call him, and a transgender person on the supposed far left. You know what I mean? And then these two were the two that worked together and got along the best on that show than what the other two did. So
yeah, I think
Or
there is
like that
issue.
recent bill as well. That recent bill, I'll just to piggyback on what you're saying, centrist. That recent party registration bill, about controlling minor parties and how big they have to be to actually be able to register. To see Craig Kelly, who's definitely right wing, vote against it, and also see the Greens vote against it as well, is just goes to prove your point. So you go ahead, AusRattleSnake. Sorry for cutting in there. Just you go ahead.
I've kind of forgotten what I was going to say there.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Oh, actually, that's what it was.
Yeah.
So I think one of the dangers that we see in our current culture at the moment, especially with the media, is the media has gotten incredibly opinionated and is more towards opinions over facts. And you see this all the time, all over it. And I think if you look at news sources like The Guardian, if you look at news sources like Ben Shapiro, if you look at news sources sort of like that more opinion side of things, where they're trying to sell you a caricature of your opponents.
Yeah.
So one of the caricatures that I see the right trying to push is that people on the left have got mental disorders. And that's not okay.
Yeah,
it's really not okay. You're not. It's always trying to sell this straw man, this sort of, oh, you think this way because you are X, and that is what authoritarians tend to do. They tend to say, "Hey, this is the enemy. This is what they're like. You don't need to listen to them, and if you listen to them, then you are the enemy." And it treats them as another. It treats them as lesser, and I'm really against that sort of thing. I treat everyone as an equal human being, and I want to listen to everyone's point of view, even if I think they're wrong.
Yeah, and the media also loves using controlled opposition, people that they've vetted in order to pretend to be a contrary, the opposite opinion, which doesn't do any justice to. Like, if you've got a disagreement in opinions, then you should have an honest, open discussion about it. I don't know why in society we've decided this is not a valid thing to do. Like, I remember when you used to sit there and, like, I would go and watch debates between two different people who believed in two different things and listen to them back and forth and then make my decision up based on what the debates were. But nowadays, it's like, you basically, if you do bring someone on that's supposedly the other side, they're usually the ones that are green, if that makes sense. Like, or like they're not really again, and it does an injustice to the people who want to hear both sides of a story, because at the end of the day, you're never going to agree on everything, and to think that one side is always right compared to the other side is really, really disingenuous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's partly because open discussion between different groups is a threat to the establishment.
Yeah.
Because when we have open discussions, we find out that, like, me and Socialist, we're in very different sides of this political spectrum, but we can get along and we can have very valid discussions and we can challenge each other and both come out of that discussion a better person, is a threat to the establishment. Who wants to keep us sort of below and not let us rise up as better people.
Yeah, politics ruins everything.
Yep.
You're not wrong.
All right.
I found the Sky News host, Graham Richardson. That's what I was thinking of. Graham Richardson. He used to be on with. It used to be Richo and Jones. It was.
See, I never really got into Sky News. Like, I've watched a bit of it here and there. I just really never. I never really sort of gelled with the host, to be honest. They sort of, like, I'll follow a few of them online and stuff like that just to sort of keep a track of what they're saying. But I don't follow Sky News because I necessarily agree with them. Like, it's only very rarely. But I've stopped watching a lot of mainstream media at the moment. I think the podcasts are a better way to go. And I think, like we talked about Ben Shapiro before. I listen to Ben Shapiro quite a bit, but not because I agree with Ben. I have some pretty hard opposition to a lot of what he says in certain things. But at the same time, I listen to Ben so I know what the right's thinking. And I know, and Ben does that. He tells me, and I know where it's coming from, and I know the angle it's coming from. I don't have to worry about looking for the bias. It's there. I see it, and he doesn't hide it. So at least then I know that the information he's giving me is giving me it with a slight slant towards the right. Yeah. So, you know, you can have it. Same as when I listen to like Crystal Ball from Breaking Points with Saga. Like Crystal's quite left. And I can hear, like, when she talks, you know that she's coming from a slight left point of view. Like you can see it, and then you can understand and interpret that information. Yeah. And then make sure that when you adjust it between the two different sources, you can actually sort of bring it back together and find out where the truth sort of lies anyway. Yeah.
And that is also really good because you sometimes see where they agree on certain things, where the left and right agree, and you find truth in those points when they start to agree on things.
I love it when it's on Twitter and like the left or the right start attacking each other over something. And I'm like, do you guys even listen to what the people you're attacking them think about? Like the Ben Shapiro has been copying heaps lately about all these people would jump on his page and be like, oh, you're the reason why there's so many unvaccinated people and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, dude, you clearly never listened to Ben Shapiro because he has been one of the most pro-vax people in all of America. I mean, like, the guy does not shut up about how amazing the vaccines are. Yeah. And I'm like, and these people are like, you're the reason there's so many non-vax. I'm like, you clearly have no clue what you're talking about. It's quite ironic to see people do that just because it's tribal.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this sort of tribalistic type of media that you can get online. And it's not mainstream media, it's independent media, and it's usually on YouTube where it's somebody says, or like you might get a leftist who's like, oh, Ben Shapiro said X, and this is Ben Shapiro's point of view, and Ben Shapiro's bad. Yeah. And so people who listen to that have never actually listened to Ben Shapiro. But then you get that on the other side as well, where they'll be like, I don't know, who's a leftist that people listen to a lot?
Kyle Kalinski's one. He does Kyle Kalinski does a lot of the. He does. I was really disappointed because I listened to him on Rogan. I was like, "Base, this guy's pretty cool. Like, I like where he's coming from. I like what he's saying. It's pretty cool." And then the first few things I went and looked online for his stuff was, it was basically attacking Ben Shapiro and like, this is what Ben Shapiro is not telling you, and this is. I'm like, dude, just tell me the story from your point of view. That's all I want to know. I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear you bitch about old mate. You just tell me your story, what you think's important, and then I'll listen to what you have to say, and then we'll go from there. But it's this. There's this counter culture on those sort of things. You got to be careful not to fall into because you're right. When you start taking someone's opinion of someone else, which is what the mainstream media do, which is why we're having this discussion today about the political spectrum, because the mainstream media tell you this is what something is. And then the more you dig into it, you find out it's actually not what that is. Like Ben Shapiro is not a white supremacist, like Google will have you think. The absurdity of that graph that went out.
To call a Jewish person a white supremacist is, in fact, racist.
It's low hanging fruit. It's an attack. It is. And it doesn't help having a proper discussion about anything. You can disagree with Ben's policy on race, that's absolutely right. But to say to a guy, an Orthodox Jew, who has been subject to hate crimes from the actual white supremacists is really, really stupid. It's a low ball, below the belt hit, and it's just doesn't help anything. It just degrades the conversation.
Yeah,
like I said, you can disagree with Ben. Like I disagree with Ben on a whole lot of issues. Like I sit there. Sometimes I'll listen to the podcast and I'll love arguing with him. I'll make a counterpoint to it just because it gets you engaged. Sometimes it's good to be engaged with people you don't agree with.
Yeah. People have lost the art of being able to listen to something and disagree with it, or read something that is against their point of view and actively disagree with it in a good way. Like,
We
there's a
all
good,
fall for
healthy
it.
way to listen to someone else's point of view and disagree with it. And then there's this sort of warped, distorted way that people have been doing for the past sort of, I guess, since 2016. It's really become an issue with like people attacking Trump and stuff, and it's sort of created this culture of people won't listen to the other side. They'll just draw this caricature of the other side and sort of attack it.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like my
Which
point
is
with
what
the. Sorry, go.
I mean. It's a bit hyperbolic, but like it's what Hitler did with the Jews. He created propaganda,
Division.
which was a caricature of what Jews were, and it wasn't true to what Jews were, and it created this culture of Germans who hated Jews, which is what we're seeing now, where people, but in a political sense, not a race sense, where people will create caricatures of the other side, and they will rag on those caricatures, and they won't actually listen to what the other side has to say.
Yeah, and it gets more and more absurd. And when you see it, when you see the absurdity of what's going on, and you step back, and you can actually some of it's just, I just really don't get how they get away with some of the stuff. Like the best example recently is like whether you agree with Larry Elder or not, the fact that LA Times ran an article calling him the blackface of white supremacy is like, how in modern day times is a newspaper like able to run a story like that? Like that should be that should be outlawed type stuff. That's like if you had said. Like it just does my head in. I honestly don't know how people can sit there and be okay with a newspaper writing that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. I think we've probably all said what we have to say on this topic, at least for this podcast. There's probably more things to say about the political compass in general in the future. And it's probably something we'll go back to again and again, right?
Yeah, maybe we can
probably
look into doing specific groups and really breaking them down into what they represent.
I think as a way to sort of stay true to that, if a socialist comes along this podcast and they want to talk to us about what they think socialism is, so we're not just creating some straw man, I'd prefer to talk about socialism with an ironclad defense of socialism there.
Yeah.
Who can actually...
Yes.
Yeah, like I would prefer to discuss socialism with a socialist present. I would prefer to discuss, I guess, statism with a statist present, and why they would argue for their points.
You guys are both statists, you know that, right?
Statists, sure.
You want ANCAPs, therefore you guys are statists. You don't believe in ANCAPs, you guys support the state.
If you're not ANCAP, you are a statist, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah. Fair.
Also, if you're not ANCAP, you're socialist as well. That's how it works these days this day and age.
Oh yeah, like I mean, if you're not socialist, you're fascist, right?
Yeah, I love purity spiraling and gatekeeping. It's
just a waste of time.
It is. It really is. And like, people will go in like massive Twitter arguments about this, and I'm like, no one's gonna win. Like, why are you wasting time?
Yeah.
Like, you're wasting your time fighting over it. No one's going to win this argument.
Yeah. And it's really an insult to other people's intelligence when you try to say, hey, you have this opinion, so I'm going to attempt to mind read and say that you're also going to have this opinion on this other topic.
That and ad hominems as well, like going after their personality or something about them. Personal attacks is like, it's not on. Keep it professional, please.
Yeah, like I think that there's this sort of thing that that's sort of been broken down over the past little while, but there was this sort of idea that if somebody is part of, say, the LGBTQ+, that means that they're automatically on the left. But we've seen that there are, people who are trans who are conservative. We've seen that there are people who are gay that are conservative. We've seen that there are people who are trans that are libertarian, and there are people who are trans who are authoritarian. There are people in all these different groups, and to be like, oh no, you're part of this one group because you look like that or you sound like that is really disingenuous.
the fact that Caitlyn Jenner is running for the GOP for California,
for the
really
government.
goes to prove that people from the LGBTQ community can be on the right. Although I am looking forward to seeing how Stephen Crowder is handling the situation because he refused to call Caitlyn Jenner Caitlyn. He would call her Bruce Jenner and call her him. I want to see what he's saying now that she's running for governor there.
Yeah.
They're both conservative, but yeah, he doesn't agree with transgenderism.
Yeah.
So I want to see how that would go for him.
You know what I would like to know though is like Stephen Crowder's a showman, so he says that on his show. I don't know if he'd actually do that in private. Do you know what I mean? Like, because there's a big difference to talk about. Oh yeah, I won't do this, I won't do that. But then to be face to face with someone and be a right C hunt, it's a lot harder to do in person. I don't say he probably could do it, but I'd be interested to see that altercation at the start. And it'd be really stupid on his behalf, because if it is about unity across and trying to, your political position, politics, not religious, but politics, shouldn't be based around the religiosity of it. So it would be silly of him to cast out someone who believes the same thing him politically if they're going to agree with him. Like, it just seems counterproductive for your goal if you want to have for example, for him, if he wants to have a more conservative point.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's another issue in general, is people like to put religious groups into political camps. Yeah. For example, if you're Christian, that makes you a right-wing conservative, when in fact I am a Christian and I voted in favor of gay marriage because I believe that marriage in the form of the state, it shouldn't discriminate.
Yes. Yeah, there's two different arguments to have there around that particular issue. There was two different arguments to have. And again, this is the polarization of society, is that if you can't have the nuanced discussion about, like, there should have been an easy middle ground. It shouldn't have even needed a vote. You should just be like, in the eyes of the state, fine. In the eyes of the church, let the church do whatever they want. Like, because to be honest, if you are gay and, like, if you go to a church and they say no, do you really want to get married there anyway? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, screw it.
And I mean,
they're going to be,
yeah. When you look at religion, you can have religious fundamentalism, which is in the right wing of the top right of our political compass here. But I've also met, say, a socialist Christian. I've met socialist Christians before who believe that Jesus was a socialist. I've met anarcho-Christians who believe in anarchy and Christianity.
I'm right here,
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly. And there is arguments in the Bible that people can make for anarcho-Christianity. There are arguments for fundamental Christianity in the Bible. There are arguments for socialist Christianity in the Bible. And it depends on interpretations and all of that. So, you know, just because someone's Christian doesn't put them in one camp on this spectrum. Just because someone's Muslim, it doesn't put them on one camp in this. So I think, you got to understand that there's more to someone's identity than their religion, their race, their gender, all of that sort of stuff. And, you know, political, I guess, your political camp is not dependent on those other aspects of your identity.
I think you're pretty spot on. So obviously we're running low on time now, I think.
I think we've...
we'll do quickly what we'll cover, bring it back to specifically down to the compass and the spectrum about where political groups in Australia sit and where you guys think they sit and where I might think they sit. And then maybe discuss that for the last, say, 10 minutes, and then we'll call it
sounds good.
For the day. Yep. Cool. All right. So in Australia, we have two main parties. We have the Liberal Party, which is considered our conservative, not far conservative, just conservative. And we've got the Labor Party, which is considered our left. I've always maintained, and that's our two major parties. So develop into that a bit more as we go, because we've obviously got some Christian right parties, we've got some far left parties. The Greens are sort of more left than the Labor, who's they team up with, and the Nationals are probably more right than the Liberals. And then we're starting to get some growth in some different minority parties, which is good to see. I think we've got the Lib Dems who are coming through now that are sort of libertarianism, although it's hard because obviously there's different people's different view on libertarianism, as we've discussed.
You've got the party itself is probably more of a classical liberal sort of party. Campbell Newman are probably more.
He's not.
More conservative. He doesn't like his own party. It does depend. David Linehelm is probably a bit more than a classical liberal. So it just depends, person to person, because it's such a broad spectrum of people.
Yeah. And for people who don't understand how the Australian system works, we are represented by a series of different parties, not individuals, more so. So, like, there is the aspect of individuals, but it's more about the party. So that's why in Australia we go through so many different prime ministers, because the party is in power, not the individual, and they just sort of kick out someone they don't like and swap them with someone else in the party.
Yeah. So the way that works is whichever party has control of the lower house, their party leader becomes the prime minister. The Senate isn't important for that, so the prime minister is the leader of the party that has control of the lower house, and the leader has to be in the lower house to become the prime minister. So, for example, the Greens right now are led by Di Natale. Is he still in Parliament? Di Natale? Do you guys know?
I'm not sure.
Because he's a senator. He was party leader because the Greens are a smaller party. They're not in power. He's allowed to be the party leader and be in the Senate.
He's a former Australian senator.
But isn't Adam Bandt the leader now?
Actually, I think you're right. I think Adam Bandt is, but Di Natale was the leader and a senator, so that's allowed because he wasn't the biggest party, but the prime minister
Adam
has
Bandt
to be
is
in the lower house.
A member of the Australian Parliament. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be a member of the lower house to be a party leader if your party has control of the lower house. That's how that works. And I think we've got three big parties to go with. So we've got One Nation, which is nationalists.
Yes, they are very nationalist.
On this compass we've got here, they're nationalists. So near the top of the of alt-right, although yes, somewhere in the middle there. Canada's Australian Party, which is near One Nation. I'd say they're also very protectionist. They're a bit less pro-gun than One Nation is. One Nation is also a bit more pro-war. And then you've got Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, which is populist. As well as Jackie Lambie's Network, which is also populist. Jackie Lambie split from Clive Palmer, so they're both populist.
Yeah, and I would say that One Nation is definitely in the authoritarian camp more so than other parties, because they are willing to what's it called? They've got policies around speech and stuff like that. So they are anti LGBTQ plus pronoun speech and all of that sort of stuff. So they want to regulate against that sort of speech, which I see as authoritarian.
There was the whole ban the burqa movement by their leader Pauline Hanson, who wore a burqa. She wore a burqa into the Senate to protest and say, we should not allow burqas in Australia. So not very well liked, that party. They're quite nationalists.
There is a small group of people who like them, obviously, because they are in the conversation and they have got seats at the table. But I
know Sky News likes them. Sky News often has One Nation on as panel guests.
I think something else we should point out too is we're talking about these parties at the moment, so everyone understands is that these minor parties don't generally gain enough support to have a massive influence. And a lot of that also comes down to the fact that the two parties we talked about, which is the Labor and Liberals, which are your left and your right, are both very centrist. They're not. People will say, "Oh, they're right wing and they're left wing," but to be honest, they are pretty similar to each other, as shown by the last few bills that they forced through whilst we've been having this COVID thing with bipartisan support. And both of those bipartisan supports were both on bills on very authoritarianism type legislation, which is not good for people who are on the liberalism spectrum, because that wasn't good to see when your two major parties are doing that sort of thing.
One bill limited minor party access, and the other party, the other bill was one covered on the last show, the Identify and Disrupt bill, which dealt with police getting access to your phones and computers and social media to use information against you.
Yes.
So they're both definitely authoritarian bills. I think
there's a lot of information about how we're turning into a bit of a police state at the moment in Australia on the internet. There's like Friendly Geordies did a video on it recently that I saw, and there's a few more popular YouTubers who have started to talk about this issue of Australia becoming more of an authoritarian police state, and that's on both of the main parties.
Yeah, it was actually really good.
I would say that Labor Party is more sort of, they teeter that line of statism and authoritarianism, whereas the Liberal Party is more teetering that line of authoritarianism and conservatism.
Yeah, but they're both very
close to the centre.
Yeah, and up as well.
They're authoritarian, but they're close to the centre.
Especially in the last 12 months.
Just for reference to the people who are listening,
right wing, and capitalists would both call them left wing, because
for the people who are listening to the audio version, the label is status, authoritarianism, and conservative. Reference to the political compass we've got up here. So statism is your middle left, conservative is your middle right, and authoritarianism is your middle. Just for reference for the people listening to the audio only version of the show.
And that's in the top quadrant as well.
Yes, so that's all top quadrant.
Yeah.
So not quite dictators, but getting pretty close.
Yeah, because I mean,
of course, it depends. It depends who the person is as well. So the Premier of Tasmania is probably the best right now, and then he's liberal. But then you've got the Berejiklian, who's liberal, who's quite bad, and McGowan, Palaszczuk, and Andrews, who are also quite bad. They're all Labor. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, because I mean, our Liberal Party is very corporatist. Like, they're very much about making money for multinational companies and bailing out our big mining tycoons and stuff like that whenever they have the opportunity.
Yeah, Labor does it too. It just doesn't seem to.
They definitely do. Yeah,
like Mark McGowan did some deals with Stokes and that. Like, there was a thing he did during the pandemic where he gave Stokes sort of special privilege in terms of skipping, skipping the quarantine and then banning all these onshore mine site type things where only his one was the only one that went ahead. And people don't seem to care. But I said if he was doing that with Murdoch, you would never hear the end of it. So it's really interesting seeing that people will stick their head in the sand when it's their team's corporatism that's going on. So,
and I think both of the main parties sort of exist to sell Australia's resources off to the highest bidder.
Yep.
I think we could go on this for hours on Australian politics, but I think we'll finish up here. We've hit the hour 30 mark.
I think we might be able to get into this a bit more in the next podcast about where different parties sort of sit on this compass, in our view at least.
Hopefully.
And breaking down what that sort of means for Australia.
For our upcoming shows, we've got this coming weekend, we've got our first Gumtree of Liberty live stream proper coming up between myself and returning guests Jerry and CD McRae from the episode 0 stream on YouTube. We're talking about Australian interstate travel laws and COVID and the legal side of things when it comes to controlling who controls the interstate borders in Australia. Then the weekend after the weekend after that, we've got a few guests coming on. I'm still finalizing guests for that one, but we'll be looking at Christianity and libertarianism and seeing how those two interact. Because I know myself and Rattlesnake here are both Christian. We've got a few coming on from America as well to talk about that with us. And then next show we could be talking next recording episode 3 will probably be going into more detail about Australian political parties and how they operate and how the Australian government works as a whole. And we'll have Jerry coming back on for that one again, just to share some of her life experience with Australian political parties. You know, obviously being the most experienced in terms of, you know, knowing how the Australian system works. It would be great to talk to her and see what her thoughts are on how the government's operated for the last 30, 40 years as a whole. Anyway, I think that covers everything. Make sure if you're on the YouTube to like and subscribe. I've got to do the stereotypical YouTuber, you know, like and subscribe, leave a comment below, that sort of stuff.
That like button.
If you're on the podcasting only apps, so like iTunes and Spotify and all that, should be up within a week, hopefully. Apart from that, you can follow our social media. I am LibertyDownUnder, UNDER on Instagram, UNDR on Twitter, and then CentristOzzy and Rattlesnake, obviously their ats there as well. AusRattleSnake and CentristOzzy as well. You can find both of them on Twitter. I don't think you guys have Instagram, right?
No, no Instagram.
No Instagram. At least not.
No.
Yeah, mine's more of a private thing, not a political thing. Yeah.
I think it's covered everything. So until next time, it's bye from us.
See ya.